Picture a time when everyday life unfolded without warning labels, disclaimers, or legal fine print. A time when rules were fewer, enforcement was loose, and trust quietly filled the gaps. Not some distant medieval past, but the 1970s, a decade that now feels closer than it truly was. Back then, the world ran on assumption, the assumption that people knew what they were doing, that neighbors looked out for one another, that a little danger was simply part of living. Children played hard on unforgiving concrete. Adults drove long distances without seatbelt reminders or dashboard alerts. Public spaces weren't wrapped in regulations. They were shared, improvised, and often chaotic. There was no constant supervision, no culture of intervention. If something went wrong, it was chalked up to bad luck, poor judgment, or one of those things. Responsibility rested squarely on the individual, not the institution. And for many, that felt natural, even comforting. Airports smelled of cigarette smoke. Schools doubled as workshops. Homes were filled with products that today would trigger recalls and lawsuits. Communities gathered without permits. Businesses operated on handshakes, and authority figures relied more on discretion than documentation. To modern eyes, it feels reckless, almost unbelievable. But to those who lived it, it was simply normal life. A world where freedom often came before safety and convenience outweighed caution. Where the idea of being told you couldn't do something felt more foreign than the risk itself. This was a society still shaped by post-war confidence, not yet humbled by litigation, regulation, and scientific hindsight. A world that trusted people to manage their own limits until, slowly and quietly, that trust began to erode. To understand how much has changed, we have to step back into that world before the rules arrived. The 1970s did not begin as a decade of caution. It inherited its mindset from the decades before it, an era shaped by post-war optimism, industrial growth, and a deep belief in personal responsibility. Governments were smaller, regulations thinner, and daily life operated on the assumption that most people could be trusted to use common sense. Safety existed, but it was informal, unwritten, and often learned the hard way. Yet beneath the surface, change was already underway. The same decade that celebrated independence and improvisation also witnessed rising concerns that could no longer be ignored. Environmental damage became visible in polluted rivers and smog-filled cities. Medical research began linking everyday products to long-term health risks. High-profile accidents, lawsuits, and investigative journalism exposed the cost of unchecked freedom. Slowly, the public mood began to shift. What makes the 1970s so historically fascinating is that it sat directly between two worlds. On one side was the old culture, built on trust, minimal oversight, and a tolerance for risk. On the other was the modern era, defined by regulation, liability, consumer protection, and institutional responsibility. The transition did not happen overnight. There was no single law, no sudden awakening. Instead, change crept in quietly, rule by rule, standard by standard. At the time, most people didn't feel like they were living dangerously. They felt practical, efficient, sensible. If something worked, it stayed. If a practice saved time or money, it was rarely questioned. Only later would experts, lawmakers, and courts step in to say this was never safe to begin with. This gap between perception and hindsight is where history lives. Looking back, it's tempting to judge the past by modern standards. But the goal is not to mock or scold a previous generation. It is to understand how values evolve, and why societies eventually decide that trust alone is not enough. The 1970s were not reckless by intention. They were transitional by circumstance. And in that transition, everyday life briefly existed in a space that now feels almost unimaginable. In the 1970s, public spaces were designed less around protection and more around participation. Stadiums, parks, streets, and town squares functioned on an unspoken agreement. People were expected to manage themselves. Oversight existed, but it was light, informal, and often symbolic. The idea that every shared space needed layers of rules and safeguards had not yet taken hold. At sporting events, this attitude was impossible to miss. Fans arrived carrying coolers packed with food and drinks, setting up in the stands as if they were attending a neighborhood picnic. Security checks were minimal, and glass containers were common. The atmosphere felt personal, almost domestic, even inside massive arenas. The responsibility for behavior rested on the individual, not the venue. Playgrounds followed the same philosophy. Equipment was built solid and unforgiving, metal structures anchored over bare concrete or hard-packed dirt. There were no warning signs, no padded surfaces, and no adult hovering close by. Children learned quickly what hurt and what didn't. Scrapes and bruises were treated as lessons, not emergencies. Parents watched from a distance, trusting experience to do the teaching. Community celebrations were equally unrestrained. Parades rolled through town with little separation between spectators and moving vehicles. Candy was tossed directly into the street, and children rushed forward without hesitation. At block parties, streets closed themselves without permits or paperwork. Smoke from grills and improvised cookers filled the air as neighbors gathered with no official oversight, just shared understanding. Concerts pushed this freedom even further. Festival-style seating meant crowds surged toward the stage, packed shoulder to shoulder, with little control once the music began. Barriers were rare. Ushers and staff had limited authority, and fans accepted the risk as part of the experience. The chaos wasn't seen as a flaw. It was the energy that made live music unforgettable. Even casual neighborhood entertainment reflected this mindset. Outdoor movie nights appeared on lawns and driveways without licenses or insurance. A rented projector, a bedsheet, and word of mouth were enough. Families brought their own chairs, their own refreshments, and their own sense of responsibility. What tied all these spaces together was a shared tolerance for uncertainty. Risk was not hidden or engineered away. It was visible and accepted. Public life in the 1970s trusted people to navigate danger on their own terms. Only later would society decide that shared spaces required more than goodwill to keep everyone safe. Transportation in the 1970s reflected the broader culture of the time. Practical, informal, and built on personal judgment rather than strict enforcement. Whether traveling by car, plane, or bus, passengers moved through systems that assumed adults could manage their own behavior, even when that behavior involved clear risks by today's standards. On the roads, driving culture was relaxed and deeply social. Long highway trips often turned into rolling conversations, fueled by CB radios, crackling with voices from passing trucks and family sedans alike. Drivers shared warnings, jokes, and road conditions in real time, forming temporary communities at 60 miles an hour. Speed limits were newly imposed, but enforcement felt uneven, and many drivers viewed them as suggestions rather than rules. Inside the vehicle, expectations were minimal. Open drink containers were not uncommon, and few questioned the idea of sipping while cruising down a familiar stretch of road. Seatbelt use was inconsistent at best, and child restraints were rare. Cars themselves were frequently modified at home, emissions equipment removed, engines tuned for power, safety features altered or ignored. These changes were seen as mechanical know-how, not legal violations. Public transportation carried the same tone. City buses featured ashtrays and open vents, their interiors often clouded with cigarette smoke. Drivers smoked, passengers smoked, and no one considered it a public health concern. Trains followed similar patterns, with designated smoking sections that rarely contained the haze drifting through the cars. Air travel, too, belonged to a different era. Commercial flights felt less regulated and more indulgent. Passengers lit cigarettes at their seats, and smoke filled the cabin from takeoff to landing. Alcohol flowed freely, even in economy class, with no added fees or identification checks. Flying was treated as an experience, not merely a transaction, and comfort often took priority over caution. Behind the scenes, the systems that governed transportation were still catching up. Safety standards existed, but many were voluntary or loosely enforced. Liability law had not yet transformed companies into risk-averse institutions. When accidents happened, they were often attributed to human error rather than systemic failure. The result was a transportation network that moved efficiently but informally, a world where convenience outweighed precaution and trust replaced oversight. In hindsight, the risks are obvious. But at the time, this balance between freedom and danger felt not only acceptable, but normal. In the 1970s, schools were not insulated environments. They were extensions of the working world, designed to prepare students for adulthood through direct exposure rather than controlled simulation. Education emphasized experience first, caution second. The result was a learning environment that felt practical, immersive, and by modern standards, astonishingly unguarded. Classrooms often spilled into workshops and industrial spaces. Shop classes placed students at lathes, welding stations, and engine blocks with minimal protective equipment. Safety rules existed, but they were brief, verbal, and often overshadowed by the expectation that students would learn by doing. Mistakes were part of the process. A burn, a cut, or a close call was treated as a lesson rather than a failure of oversight. Science education followed a similar philosophy. Experiments involved real chemicals, open flames, and improvised setups that would never pass today's risk assessments. Students mixed compounds, launched homemade rockets, and handled lab equipment with little more than curiosity and enthusiasm guiding them. Goggles and gloves were optional, not mandatory. Teachers focused on results, not precautions. Field trips reinforced this exposure. Classes were taken directly into factories, power plants, and industrial facilities. Students walked near heavy machinery, molten materials, and moving assembly lines wearing everyday clothing. Hard hats and safety briefings were rare. The goal was to show how the real world worked, not to shield students from it. Even student behavior reflected this hands-off approach. Some schools maintained designated smoking areas for teenagers, officially acknowledging habits that would later be banned outright. Teachers enforced order in the classroom, but often ignored what happened in courtyards and hallways. Authority relied more on mutual understanding than strict control. The underlying belief was simple. Young people needed to be trusted with responsibility before they could learn it. Risk was seen as a necessary component of growth, not something to be engineered away. Schools mirrored the society around them, one that valued toughness, independence, and practical skill. Over time, this approach would be reconsidered. Lawsuits, injuries, and shifting expectations transformed schools into regulated environments with clear boundaries. But in the 1970s, education still carried the rough edges of the real world, and learning came with consequences as tangible as the lessons themselves. Inside the average home of the 1970s, safety was guided less by regulation and more by habit. Houses were treated as private domains, largely free from inspection or oversight. What happened behind the front door was considered a family matter, managed through experience, intuition, and a belief that common sense was enough. Household chemicals were everywhere, stored without locks or warning labels. Powerful cleaners, solvents, pesticides, and treatments were kept under sinks or in garages within easy reach. Instructions were brief, risks rarely explained. If a product worked, it stayed in use. Long-term health concerns were not part of the conversation. Effectiveness mattered more than caution. Electrical systems reflected the same mindset. When fuses blew or wiring failed, homeowners often relied on improvised solutions rather than professional repairs. Quick fixes kept the lights on and the appliances running. Fire risk was understood in theory, but rarely enough to override practicality. Insurance inspections and building codes existed, but enforcement was inconsistent and easy to ignore. Heating homes in colder months carried its own hazards. Kerosene heaters and space heaters were common, even in poorly ventilated rooms. The smell of fuel was familiar, accepted as a sign that warmth had been restored. Parents issued simple warnings: don't touch, don't tip, but safety devices and carbon monoxide detectors were not standard. Backyards revealed a similar lack of barriers. Swimming pools often stood unfenced, without alarms or self-closing gates. Neighborhood children wandered in freely during summer afternoons, sometimes without adults present. The pool was a shared feature of the block, not a legal liability. Responsibility rested on awareness and trust, not prevention. Even building materials now known to be hazardous were used without hesitation. Insulation, tiles, and household fixtures contained substances that would later be restricted or removed entirely. At the time, they were simply part of solid construction, durable, affordable, and familiar. What defined these homes was confidence. Confidence in products, in routines, and in the belief that danger could be managed through attention alone. It was a way of living that valued independence over compliance. Only later would regulations step inside the home, reshaping private life with standards designed to protect what experience alone could not. Childhood in the 1970s was defined by independence. From an early age, children were expected to navigate the world with minimal supervision, learning boundaries through experience rather than constant oversight. Freedom was not a privilege. It was the default. Bicycles were a symbol of that freedom. Kids rode for miles without helmets, racing down hills and weaving through traffic with little more than confidence and balance to protect them. Scrapes and spills were accepted as part of growing up. Protective gear existed, but wearing it often invited ridicule rather than reassurance. Neighborhoods functioned as open territory. Children roamed from house to house, disappearing for entire afternoons without check-ins or schedules. Parents trusted that kids would find their way home by dinner. Strangers were not automatically viewed as threats, and the idea of constant monitoring would have felt excessive. Hitchhiking, particularly during fuel shortages, reflected this same trust. Teenagers and even younger kids accepted rides from neighbors or passers-by heading in the same direction. It was seen as practical and polite, not dangerous. Offering or accepting a ride was part of community life, not a calculated risk. Work also came early. Many teenagers held jobs that would now raise legal and safety concerns. Late-night shifts at gas stations, diners, and convenience stores were common, often with young workers handling cash alone. Parents viewed these jobs as character building, proof of responsibility and independence. Play itself was largely unsupervised. Tire swings hung from old trees over hard ground. Frozen lakes became skating rinks. Construction sites, fields, and vacant lots turned into playgrounds without fences or warnings. Adults intervened only when something went seriously wrong. The prevailing belief was that resilience came from exposure. Children were expected to assess danger, make mistakes, and learn from them. Protection, when it existed, was informal and reactive rather than preventive. In hindsight, the risks are clear. Injuries, accidents, and worse were inevitable, but within that environment, childhood felt expansive. Freedom shaped confidence, and responsibility arrived early. The balance between independence and safety would shift in later decades, but for a time, growing up meant being trusted to handle the world as it was. In the 1970s, much of daily commerce operated on trust rather than verification. Business transactions were personal, informal, and often built on familiarity instead of documentation. The systems that now rely on identification, surveillance, and digital records were still decades away from becoming standard. At banks, a recognizable face and a steady signature were often enough to cash a sizable check. Photo identification was not universally required, and electronic verification didn't exist. Tellers relied on memory and reputation, especially in smaller towns. Fraud happened, but it was seen as the exception, not the rule. Workplaces followed similar assumptions. Teenagers were routinely hired for adult responsibilities, with little concern for age restrictions or liability. Late shifts at gas stations, diners, and corner shops placed young workers alone with cash and equipment. Employers valued reliability over regulation, and parents encouraged work as a rite of passage rather than a risk. Law enforcement reflected this trust-based approach as well. Police officers often handled minor offences with discretion instead of paperwork. Curfew violations ended with a lecture and a ride home. Authority was personal, not procedural. Officers saw themselves as part of the community first, enforcers second. Even corporate culture operated differently. Business lunches stretched into long afternoons, fueled by cocktails and handshake agreements. Deals were made face-to-face, sealed with verbal commitments rather than legal teams. Professional boundaries were looser, and expectations were shaped by social norms more than formal policy. This reliance on the honor system created efficiency and flexibility, but it also carried vulnerabilities. As populations grew and transactions became less personal, trust alone proved insufficient. Fraud, liability, and inequality exposed the limits of informal systems. By the end of the decade, institutions began to shift. Documentation increased, rules multiplied. What was once handled through familiarity now required proof. The change felt impersonal to many, but it marked the beginning of a world where accountability no longer depended on knowing someone's name. Commerce in the 1970s functioned on a level of personal trust that feels almost foreign today. Transactions were shaped by familiarity, reputation, and direct human judgment rather than formal verification. In many cases, who you were mattered more than what paperwork you carried. Banks were a clear example. Cashing a check often required nothing more than a signature and a confident exchange across the counter. In smaller communities especially, tellers recognized customers by face or name. Identification was optional, not mandatory. The system assumed honesty as the norm, and when abuse occurred, it was treated as an unfortunate exception rather than a structural flaw. The workforce reflected the same assumptions. Teenagers regularly held jobs with significant responsibility, sometimes working late nights or operating equipment with minimal supervision. Gas stations, diners, and small retail shops depended on young workers to handle cash, manage customers, and close up alone. Age restrictions and labor protections existed on paper, but enforcement was uneven. Families viewed early work as a moral lesson, proof of discipline and reliability. Policing also leaned heavily on discretion. Officers often resolved minor issues through conversation rather than citations. A teenager caught out past curfew might receive a warning instead of a fine. The goal was correction, not punishment. Law enforcement relied on personal authority and community relationships more than rigid procedure. In the business world, formality was often secondary to rapport. Deals were negotiated over lunches that stretched into afternoons. Contracts existed, but many agreements rested on verbal commitments and mutual confidence. A handshake carried weight, serving as both promise and proof of intent. Legal departments were smaller, and litigation was not the first response to conflict. This system worked best in a slower, more localized economy. As cities grew, transactions increased, and anonymity replaced familiarity. Cracks began to show. Trust without verification became harder to sustain. Fraud, disputes, and liability forced institutions to adapt. By the end of the decade, commerce was already shifting toward documentation and enforcement. The handshake remained a symbol, but no longer a guarantee.